Recording is on.
Cool.
Okay, so we're the Ruby Developer Book Club, and we're starting on Chapter 4, Methods and Their Arguments. So in this chapter, we're going to read about uh, understanding that there are no class methods, only instance methods, naming methods, using the many types of method arguments. And that's about what we're planning to discuss today. And then the rest we'll cover in a next week's session. Um, okay, so understanding that there are no class methods, only instance methods. Um, Maybe actually we should open up Ruby under a microscope. This section here, defining methods on singleton class. So from the Ruby under the microscope, this is the section that describes what happens uh, when we use when we basically create a what we would call a class method. And so you have this class quote. You basically have a reference to self, and you open up you attach or you open up the singleton class to add the method definition here. Um, the arrows here are a little confusing because you have this thing here that is a C structure called R class. The R class is called quote, and then you have a separate thing called the R class meta class. And so this uh, this new method gets attached to the thing that we're calling the R class meta class for quote. Um, and basically, the way I understand what's happening here is that you have a linked list with nodes. You have node next and node class. And basically, you're saying, I'm going to have a link here for this meta class thing. And that's where I'm going to put this class method. And so when Ruby goes looking for the method, it will use this linked list, traverse the linked list to try to find if there's a method in there in that node. Um, so I think it's worth rereading this process here just to remind ourselves what is actually going on. So Ruby first evaluates the expression that appears right after class, and then um, is this? Can I call this like left shovel? What is this? Um,
Gosh, I usually call it less than, but maybe that's not the greatest name. You could also call it the left shift operator, but it's not operating like a left shift operator. So I don't know what you would call it.
okay. Um,
That's a good question, though.
okay. So we're just gonna say we're this operator in listing 9.3, this is the expression self, which evaluates to the quote class, just as it did using the object prefix syntax in listing 9.2. The long arrow extending to the right from, oh, I guess we can call it the long arrow. Wait, extending
Yeah,
to the right from
He's
self?
talking about He's
Oh, the
literally talking about
diagram.
the arrow in the diagram. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Never mind. Extending to the right from self to the R class structure indicates the value of self is the quote class. Ruby finds the class for the object the expression evaluates to. In listing 9.3, this will be the class of quote or quote's metaclass, indicating by the arrow extending down from quote to the metaclass for quote on the right side of the figure. Ruby creates a new lexical scope for this class. In the example, the lexical scope uses the meta class of quote, indicated by the arrow extending to the right from end class in the new scope. So when he's talking about lexical scope, it's just, you know, this starts the lexical scope, the end ends the lexical scope, right? So we are defining a new lexical scope with this syntax. Okay, so that's what Ruby under the microscope had to say about this. I really wanted to just pull up the diagram because it's easier to see in a diagram that, like, okay, well, we have these other structures. These other structures are where we're going to save the method definition. And when we look for that method definition, we're going to traverse this node list in order to find it. Right. Okay.
Yeah,
So.
interestingly, I was just going to say real quick that I've kind of been inspired to try to make my own diagram around the singleton class thing. And I had mentioned this to Newton recently, just that the singleton class stuff keeps coming up repeatedly in this book club. And I couldn't find like a really good diagram showing, or a diagram that I felt was like a great diagram. So maybe at some point I'll take a swing at that and see if I get a good result. But I feel inspired to try to make some learning material around singleton class just because it comes up all the time. I think it's a good point that the book made. So I took a note of this, that maybe clarifying that there are only instance methods could have helped with some of the previous section, like the last chapter we read, because I think what happens is we have this, the most common use for the singleton class seems to be creating class methods like what we see right here. And we conceptually think, oh, I need to create a method on the class. And we distinguish that from an instance method on the class. And I feel like this clarification that there are only instance methods, therefore that what we're doing here has to be an instance method somewhere, but it's not on this class, so it's on the singleton class. And maybe that would help conceptually. But the mental model is like we're putting a method on the class, but the actual implementation is we're putting an instance method on the singleton class of the class. Um, and maybe that's still confusing. I don't know, but yeah, I was just kind of sharing that. I took 2 notes on that here that around that this keeps coming up, and that maybe it helps to, maybe it is good that the book is clarifying that there's no such thing as class methods.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's important to know that there are different structures, right, and different places where you can put this method, and it doesn't just go on like it doesn't just get attached to the instance. The class also has its own set of functions that. Uh, and instance. I don't know how to say that correctly, but
Well, yeah, I think that's what kind of causes the confusion though, is because do you remember how there was that class pointer that was with a K in Ruby under a microscope?
mm-hmm.
That class pointer points to the singleton class, even though in the terminal, if you type whatever.class, it will skip over that and it'll keep going through the ancestors and it'll skip the singleton class. It'll skip all the modules until it finally hits a proper class. And I think that kind of causes confusion. But I think that the author's point here is you're creating this self.bar. All that's doing is getting the class of foo, as in lowercase class pointer, which is the singleton class, and we're putting an instance method there. Just like if we wanted all instances of foo to have a method called bar, we would just do def.foo to put an instance method on the class foo. But I feel like a diagram would help. I think what I'm saying is kind of confusing without a diagram. So I think I'll try to make a diagram, but I just feel like there's an ongoing confusion in the Ruby book club, and therefore probably through the whole Ruby community, particularly people learning Ruby around. I kind of feel like the author's point here is that there are not different structures for storing methods. There are only classes and you can only store instance methods. But the mental model is that there's different ways to do it. But the implementation is that there's exactly one way to do it. It is the way I'm thinking about it, which, you know, we should probably move on because I think I'm not doing a good job of communicating what I'm getting at. And
Okay.
yeah.
I mean, I think from the other point of confusion is that, at least from our previous conversation last week, is that singleton class, like the terminology, is can be used for what we're talking about, but it can also be used for design patterns. And the singleton class in the design pattern, it is not. Is not what we're talking about. It's not something that uh, is implemented in the Ruby internals. What we're talking about is something in the Ruby internals.
Yeah. I used to try to call it an eigen class, and other people were doing that too. But since the Ruby method is singleton class and most people call it singleton class, I gave up on that. And I actually just now call it singleton class, even though I agree it's confusing for exactly that reason.
Um, well, the that is a singleton class, but there's a separate singleton class that can be created for instances. So if you have an instance, like you have foo.new, and you have, lowercase foo, you can say lowercase foo or def lowercase foo dot and then the new method, and that, if you attach, you can we'll go through it later on in this book, but there's another singleton class that can be created on individual instances.
Sorry, I think Miles showed that last week in the terminal, defining methods on like instances of classes.
Yeah, I think when you have a singleton class on on a class, it's just that the class's class pointer points to that singleton class, and with the instances, it's the same thing. Like if you have an instance of string, and you define a method on the singleton class, then its class pointer points to its singleton class. So I do think there's a distinction that comes into play with inheritance with these singleton classes. But yeah, I'm actually kind of interested to read the part later in the book that you referred to, Nelson, because now I'm curious.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah,
So this is exactly what we were doing before up here, in sorry, yeah, in self.bar. So this is just another way of saying self.bar, because up here the the value of self resolves to foo. Here we can't use self because the value of self is something else. So we just use what it would resolve to, which is uh, the class foo, but it's the same syntax. We just don't use it very much, but it's possible. And here he's pointing out that it doesn't need, like, you can write expressions here. Uh, like even self is an expression. It's not a keyword. It's it's a method that resolves to this class foo. Similarly, this is also an expression that resolves to the class foo, and we're defining bar on it. The second way that we're commonly going to define these class methods is this syntax. So instead of def self dot whatever, this is just a different syntax. It creates the same thing. Um, this third way here is just another way to do that. So you basically call instant eval to evaluate some Ruby code, and here we're the Ruby code that we're evaluating is a method definition. So it's in he says that in general, this is the best format, or the format that you should default to. It's a sensible default. It's clear. and it's common. Um, this format confused or this format confused some Ruby users because we had to like tell last week, and they hadn't seen this one before, and we had to say, oh no, it's basically the same thing as self dot or def self dot bar here. So I mean, we've experienced the fact that like, oh, this is the most common way that people will understand you in code. Um, okay, so the main case where this other syntax makes sense is if you're doing more advanced work in your class. So by more advanced work, he's talking about using the alias method or remove method on this singleton class. Because if um, you can see here that the um, removing the method and aliasing the method is pretty clear. You don't need a lot of syntax to get that done. Here, you need a lot more syntax, and there's just a lot more line noise here. So that's one case where it would be clearer to use this double arrow syntax.
I guess something that I wanted to point out is that I disagree with the author on this point. I have a preference for the double less than syntax for a few reasons. One is that it gives a clear place to group these types of methods. And you also, a weird thing that comes up is that sometimes we'll start off a project with the def self approach, and then it starts to get problematic for one reason or another, including the reasons mentioned in the book, but there's other ones. And then we have to refactor it, and this causes a huge diff. Whereas if you did class less than self, you don't wind up with that big diff. You can also change from class less than self to like module class methods if you want. Again, without having to change any of the code or affecting the diff and the git blame. So I just have a disagreement with the author. I think if you're doing a small project, I think it doesn't matter. But if you're doing a large project that's going to live on for years and evolve in ways that you can't predict, I disagree. I think that less than self is superior for various reasons, and it's usually what I see on the projects I've worked on in the past. So it might be like a weird thing where some circles of Ruby programmers do it one way or not another, but yeah, I've just kind of learned to do less than self for the reasons I just mentioned. So just wanted to point that out.
Yeah. No, and I agree with that as well. Like the just having a place to group it, and in future avoiding big diffs, just it makes working maintaining the code in the long term that much clearer, because you don't end up with well, in this class we use this format, in this other class we use the other format. Like eventually every format should be consistent, or it's easier if all the formats in all your classes are consistent. And since eventually they all turn into that other syntax that we saw, with a double left shift, then that's going to be where we end up anyway. So why don't we just start there?
Yeah, that was my experience too.
Okay. Naming methods. So methods are one of the most common ways to organize your code. And so we pay special attention to how they're named. Um, the other reason is that it's once you name a method something, it's difficult to change the name of that method without breaking backwards compatibility, especially when you're writing a public API, other users are using your code. If you change your mind about what something is called, then you're going to break everyone's code. If you, at least for the public methods, for the private methods, you can you can change them at will. And if anyone is relying on some private methods, well, then it's their fault.
Mhm. Yeah.
Whoops. Okay, so this was an interesting thing that I've never heard of before. That the guidance here is that the length of a method name should be inversely proportional to how often the method will be called. So if you call a method very, very frequently, it should have a very short name. If it's not called very frequently, then it should have a longer name. And if you really want to discourage use of that method, it should have a really, really long name. Um,
Yeah, I had never seen this explicitly called out either, but I think subconsciously I've been kind of following this rule regardless. But yeah, this is the first time I've ever seen it explicitly stated before.
yeah, there's there's aliased methods in Ruby. So like there's index and find index are two methods that do the same thing on an array, and I would I really would prefer using index. It's just shorter. I'm going to use it a whole bunch. But find index does the same thing.
Mhm.
Um, okay, so this this seemed like he was going off topic a little bit with this unary plus at operator on strings. Uh,
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess you're right. He is kind of so one thing about that I do know about this author is he works directly on Ruby, the Matt's Ruby implementation. So it could be that he's been part of or seen conversations around whether .dupe should be the way of dealing with a frozen string or whatever.
mhm.
So yeah, that's a good point though. I guess without going deeper into this or giving examples, it might confuse some readers. And some readers might not be familiar with the at sign, but the at sign there means it's a unary operator instead of the binary plus operator. Um, so I guess yeah, there's a little bit baked in here of probably of knowledge the author has that a lot of readers wouldn't have.
Yeah, I mean the point was that like even dupe a 3-letter name was too long, so they came up with
Yeah.
2 characters. But like for me, typing 3 letters is easier than typing 2 symbols.
Well, in the code, you would only type one symbol. You would only type the plus sign. So, and that was why it would help if he had given an example. But you type plus and then the string literal. So plus double
Oh,
quote, AF double quote. Yeah, that's
mhm.
why I was saying that people might not be familiar with this at sign syntax. That at sign syntax is only when you're defining the method to clarify that you are overriding the unary plus operator and not the binary addition operator.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I
Yeah.
didn't get that. Um, yeah, so for methods that are not called frequently and you want to discourage, private instant methods, protected instant methods. So they're like, yeah, they're really long words that you're using. So he gave some other examples here. Special method names.
Can I jump in real quick? I couldn't figure out how to share an image in this chat, but I put it back in the Discord. Just wanted to share a similar idea with method names from Martin Fowler, who said he phrased it as larger scope. Like the larger your scope, then the shorter your method name should be, and the smaller your scope, the longer the method name should be. So I think it's the same end result as what this author was saying, but he's using it in terms of scope.
Oh,
So,
that's interesting.
so a
Yeah.
class.
So yeah, one thing about Ruby is that it could be that Martin Fowler is interacting more with languages that leverage scope more. Ruby, I've always felt like doesn't do the greatest job of leveraging scope. So it could be in the Ruby world, it winds up being more natural to talk about how frequently you're calling the method, even though they're not the same thing.
I misspoke there. Actually, it was Dr. Bob Martin that was saying this.
Oh, okay, got it. There is one point I did also want to add, but maybe I should wait in case anyone else had a comment on this image from the Paul shared.
Well, Bob Martin wrote a whole lot of Java, so I guess this applies. These ideas come from Java.
So
But
something I'll add is that oh, go ahead.
but I agree. It seems like very very similar advice, and it's something I've never considered before, but I like.
Yeah, so there's a point I took a note on, and I brought this up when we were talking about instance variables, but when we were talking about variable names, I also mentioned this point. But I took a note that for me, something that's important is the level of abstraction we're operating at, and I think that actually fits better with the scope concept than the frequency of calls concept. So it probably ties in better with this image that Paul had mentioned. But then Nelson also mentioned if it's a private method, you're not at risk of um, causing problems with calling code unless they're directly accessing it, in which case they kind of deserve what they get. But the point I wanted to make is if I'm using a method at a low level of abstraction, I worry less about the quality of the method name, and part of that for me winds up being often using yeah, I guess that's all I would point out. It doesn't necessarily tie in with longer or shorter, but if I'm trying to name a private method name, I don't spend a lot of time trying to figure out the greatest possible name for the method name. If it's like, especially if it's a private method in a private helper class, I just don't spend any time really thinking about the method name. But if it's a top level public class, um, and it's a public method that's like the public interface of that, then I do focus on trying to come up with a good quality name, which wasn't really mentioned in the chapter, but kind of I feel like indirectly ties in with what Nelson said about private methods and now what Paul has shared about scope. I almost feel like level of abstraction kind of ties into scope, where low level of abstraction is going to have less scope sometimes.
Oh, that's not what I wanted.
Apologies if that's confusing.
No, it's fine. Thanks.
Any other comments, or should I move on?
I just want to say that it makes sense to me as well. I'd never really thought about the whole inverse relationship between the length of the name and how frequently it's used, but it seems to make sense. And the example you gave about the methods in Rodolph's configuration made a lot of sense to me because I use that library as well. You have really long names like this when you only use them once in that config file, and that's it. It's as descriptive as you'd want it to be, but it doesn't get too I don't know, too long. You don't feel that because you don't call it so often like that. I don't have to like write it. So I think it just implicitly made sense to me, and I wanted to mention that.
Oh, one thing occurs to me as well here that this question mark, like we should always conform to the standard usage of the question mark. Where, hey, if we have this method that returns a boolean, put a question mark on it. It makes it clear that it's a boolean. If you have something that modifies memory in place, then put an exclamation point on there.
Oh, true. Yeah.
Okay, so there are a few methods that you want to give extra consideration to before you use the method's name. So toproc, call, triple equals. These are a lot of. These are frequently implemented in objects, and they have special use cases. So anytime you pass a method, um, or pass yeah, a message. Sorry, pass a block to a method. Um, you know, like if you end up calling, what's that? Hold on, let me.
Well, the symbol hack is a famous one where symbol has a 2proc method.
Yeah, you can call.
Oops. So if we do an array dot map, do
ampersand something.
or yeah, so the ampersand and whatever we're mapping, like oh, I don't know what suck.
2s. You could do 2s.
Yeah. So
Oh yeah.
this this is two things going on here. So the ampersand is basically saying the thing that I'm passing here is a block. Okay, but then we have a symbol here. So we didn't call a block. We called a symbol. So what's going to happen is we're going to use the symbol's 2proc method. And the symbol's 2proc method is going to convert this into finding a method with with that name. And so here, what we're doing is successor is basically saying, what's the successor of 1 is 2. What's the successor of 3 or 2 is 3 or whatever. So it's just incrementing by 1. So when you're creating your symbol class, you also defined a 2proc class, and that 2proc class let you do something like this. So, whoops. So here, when you're creating your own um, classes, one of the things that you can do is you can define your own 2proc, and just like symbol, you can have it do something interesting.
You
So
could
that
demo the direct call in the terminal if you wanted to, and that might help folks who aren't familiar. Like you could do :succ.2proc.call and pass it 1 so that it's clear what's happening. 2_proc and then .call and pass it 1, you should get 2 back.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's a clearer way of showing what's going on.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, this is called the symbol hack. I think it didn't used to be an official part of Ruby, but then Ruby accepted it at some point. But usually an external library, I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think usually an external library like Active Support would define 2proc on the symbol class. And then at some point it became part of Ruby proper, unless I'm remembering that wrong. But I think that's why it's called the symbol hack, because I think at one point in time it was quote unquote a hack.
Yeah, so I just wanted to define what's going on here, because that's the example that I showed is the example that he talked about here. So 2proc is called when the ampersand operator is used. So once you use the 2proc for a method, that is how the object will always act when it's passed to a block. So for me, this wasn't clear enough, and I wish he'd shown an example. And what I was trying to do in IRB was show like exactly what he was talking about. The 2proc is what's going to be used here when you're passing this as a block to another method.
Yeah, I'm kind of confused why this section is here now that I think about it, because the warning here, and it makes sense, is ultimately like wait until you actually understand how you want this class to behave in these circumstances before you define these behaviors. But I feel like I don't feel like anybody is like building a class and then just preemptively defines call, for example, under an assumption of how it might be used in the future. I think just by default, people do wait to define these methods. Then another thought I have is there's also the hash method and the equals equals method. They're not mentioned here, but I feel like they're also the same kind of special methods that play roles in certain contexts. So I don't know why those are not mentioned here. So I almost wonder if it would be worth it just to delete this subsection for the author, or maybe not. I don't know, but it's just it's actually just a thought I actually just had while we were talking through this.
Yeah, I think I agree too. Sorry, because when I got to this section, I thought he was going to say talk about not naming your methods similarly to these ones, since we're talking about naming methods. But then it seems like you're not accidentally naming your methods call or to prop, but it's telling you what to be careful about when you want to override these methods, which it seems like a different scenario, a different problem, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's I agree. Like, and I think what we should take away is that if you had, let's say, your domain had a use case where you did want to define a call function, and it was like, oh, for phones or phone numbers or whatever, and you weren't thinking, then you might forget, like, oh, call is already defined, and I'm overriding it if I define a method called call. So
True.
maybe that's enough to take away from this, and his additional meaning here that that you should wait to define these methods until you understand like what the behavior should be of that class. Yeah, maybe we just move on then.
Yeah, I guess I will just real quickly say if that's the case, then I think hash is important to call out because you can cause a lot of headaches if you define a method called hash on accident. So no, I don't think no one's gonna accidentally create an equals 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 method, and they're very unlikely to accidentally create two proc. Call, I think, actually is more legit, like the use case you gave, but then I think hash would be the second most dangerous one if call is dangerous, but that doesn't really matter, though. I think we could move on.
Sorry, let me ask something too. Okay, first off, I should say that the information in that section I think is really useful. So maybe instead of deleting it, maybe it needs to like live somewhere else. But also, I wanted to ask. Yeah, I wanted to ask about this triple equals, because I feel like he made a good point that I didn't expect here, because I've overridden this method before to kind of that was to have a different behavior for like comparing those objects like instances between themselves. So something like, I don't know, check if the a certain attribute on this one is equal to the attribute of the other one. But then he says that it's gonna act differently if you use it in a switch statement, and that's something that I didn't think about back then when I was doing that. So I think it's cool to call that out. Like, yeah, you might get the
Interesting.
behavior you want, but when you use it in a switch statement or somebody behaves differently, probably if you don't know what you're doing.
I see. So yeah, for me, the only reason I ever override equals 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 is I don't like its default behavior in a case statement. So I guess I'm already kind of following the advice of the author, and maybe that makes me incorrectly think it's not helpful advice. So maybe that's the mistake I'm making.
I see.
Yeah, like if I saw you do that in a pull request, I would give it a thumbs down. I would say you need to name this method something else. Like you're
Yeah.
abusing triple equals. Do not do this.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Some interesting thing that I learned about triple equals, and um, this is in the context of rereading Polished Ruby, was that different classes have interesting ways where different implementations of triple equals for use in case statements. So like the range class, triple equals works like cover. For regular expressions, triple equal works like the method match. For procs, triple equals works like call. If you create a new IP address instance, triple equals checks if an IP address is a member of a given subnet. So it's interesting how you can create a class, and if you want some sort of different behavior or some behavior that is more relevant to the way your class works, then in case statements, then yeah, like go ahead and override triple equals for use in case statements. But otherwise, for the most part, it's going to work like kind of, which is it's just going to check and see if the classes are equal. That's the most common way that that it's going to work. Triple equals is going to work in case statements for most classes.
Yeah, it makes sense.
I had a different example. I just learned from the last Ruby Atlanta Ruby user group of an interesting implementation of the brackets for on integer. If you have, let's say, you defined a binary number, we're going to just set it to 1111, and if you call let's say 2 on it, it's going to index this gosh. So if we call 0, it's just going to index the first one, and maybe we should just do that. What happened? Okay, yeah. So index of 1, which would be this index, because the indexes start from the right. I just didn't know that about the integer class. I use this format instead of saying 22, like the decimal representation, because it's clearer to see the binary. Okay. This is just some other examples of using the bracket syntax for databases in SQL. And then we move on to the next section. Using the many types of method arguments.
I did want to throw in another thing on the square brackets.
Yeah.
Another image I put into the Discord channel. My favorite implementation of this that I've kind of recently learned is about using struct and data. So starting from the top there, if you create a new struct, that's creating a class, and then you can call new on that, or you can just use the brackets to do the same thing.
Ooh, that's cool.
That's interesting.
It makes it really, useful, like when you think of it as that point example near the bottom with data define, which is a value object that's similar to struct. But
there's one I use sometimes, although it's not as easy to read or whatever. But if you use the angle brackets on a string, and if the first or the square brackets on a string, if the first argument is a regular expression and the second argument is an integer, it'll give you the value of the group with that index. So if you need to extract a substring using a regular expression, you can use the square brackets on string to do it really quickly. So the square brackets on string, if you pass it one integer, it'll give you the character at that index. If you pass it 2 arguments, the first one being a regular expression, the second one being a group index, it'll extract a substring for you. And that's something I use occasionally. There's actually kind of a lot of examples of making use of the square brackets to shorten the code.
All right. Using the many types of method arguments. Okay, so basically here the thrust of this section is that when if you can get away with using no arguments, that is it eliminates a whole class of errors. They're also more performant, and I'm unclear about why they're more performant, but this book says they are. And the more arguments you add, the more parameters you require on a method, uh, the more problems that you that come about. Okay, so let's see these examples. Basically, so he was in this paragraph. He was analyzing object to see to list the arity of the different methods on object. So object has something like 60 methods, and I guess 23 of them accept no arguments, and 17 accept a single argument. So basically, you know, what he's saying here is the fewer arguments, the better. And then if you do require more arguments, will be strategies later on in this chapter to deal with that. But you should focus on accepting as few arguments as makes sense. And I guess if a method requires too many arguments, it might be doing too many things. He didn't say that explicitly, but that's the only way I can think of modifying a method to accept fewer arguments, is to have it do fewer things.
There's also he gives an example later where he changes from multiple arguments to one argument by encapsulating the arguments in a class. So that would be another way to do it. Although then he also warns against doing that if that's the only reason you're doing it. But we'll get there.
Oh yeah.
Real quick, the zero arity methods, probably the so he mentions, I think somewhere in here, that if there are arguments, they have to be, they have to be popped off the stack and stuffed into a local variable in the method call. And so you don't have to do that if the arity is 0. So maybe that's the speed up, is if the arity is 1, the very first thing the method is going to do, I think, is pop from the stack and stash it into the local variable table. Whereas those instructions just won't even exist at all if the arity is 0.
Yeah.
So that's probably,
that makes sense.
That's probably why, or one reason why.
And if you call the method a million times, you're going to have to do stack operations a million times.
Yeah, and actually, I also think that would suggest that the calling code has to push a pointless argument on the stack every single time too. Assuming it's pointless, because the only way to get rid of it is that you don't need it. So if you need it, you need it, of course.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess you could restructure the method so that instead of taking arguments, you're using an instance variable.
Right. Yeah.
But I don't like doing that, because I like how providing all the arguments to the method tells you everything you need to know. I don't like it when there are special variables that, oops, I didn't think about that, and it's not documented in the method signature, but they got modified in running this method, and I don't know. I prefer that all my inputs be documented in the method signature.
Yeah, I have complicated thoughts on this, that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I feel that way about lower level code. For higher level code, I care more about the self-documentingness of the method signature. So for me, it winds up being, is this argument actually helping me understand the code at a high level or not? And then when I get to the lower level code, then it's more, I'm more inclined to like want the whole dependency injection or whatever the case may be. But yeah, but I'm probably unusual in that I've spent a lot of time thinking about exactly this. But when you use an instance variable, you can really clean up the calling code and make it self-documenting. You do lose a little bit of debugability. So it depends on what I care about. Do I want the code to be easy? Do I want it to be easy to understand the code at a low level or at a high level? And that for me is kind of case by case for what it's worth.
Okay. So that was the section where we have zero arity methods. This starts the section where we have positional arguments. Right. So once he says that one of the things that can go wrong here with positional arguments is that you don't really know. Sometimes it's hard to know like what each argument is supposed to do. So here in this rename, we're calling file 1 and file 2. So which one is which? Which is the original file name and what are we renaming it to? And that's unclear from this code. And it's unclear in the internal Ruby source code because some methods have the source and destination flipped around. So you can't rely on a single standard to say the destination is always first, the source is always second, because sometimes you're going to find that the surprises where it's the other way around. So yeah, here he's saying that they're more uncommon. So on public methods that Ruby defines in core classes, only about 2% require exactly 2 arguments. So it's a very few number that require exactly 2 arguments. So and it's even rarer to have 3 or more.
Oh, sorry. I was just really quickly going to say, because this came up earlier in the conversation, I also relax the consideration around this kind of thing in between like public and private methods. So if it's a private method, I don't really put much time thinking about the order. If it's a public method, I spend a decent amount of, especially if it's a public method in a public class, then I really consider the argument ordering. And when I get it wrong, it's really annoying.
This starts the section where you were talking about creating a different structure, different object to hold all your parameters. So in the first example here, we see that there's 4 arguments, and it's hard to know which is which. Does it go x1, x2, or does it go x1, y1? It's hard to remember that. So here we're creating a new box structure, and we pass in the box structure, and now we have, instead of a method that accepts 4 arguments, we have a method that accepts a single argument. But I mean,
I think it's really cool that he calls out the class proliferation problem. And then there's also a place in here, you see right there, he says, in other words, only create a separate class if creating a class makes sense in the domain model. That made me really happy because I'm always trying to think about code communicating the actual underlying domain model as opposed to doing a whole bunch of technical design pattern type stuff. So it's kind of cool for him to call out that like, you probably shouldn't create this box class unless it actually has some kind of meaningful role in the domain. But if you're just creating it because of the argument ordering aspects of Ruby, that you should use a different solution than creating a new class. And I totally agree with that. And it's rare that I would ever see someone express that, I feel like, although maybe other people do.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, complicate the code. Only like you want essential. You can't get rid of essential complexity, right? And defining the objects based on the domain means that you are going like that is part of the essential complexity. But then when you start abstracting more than that, then you're adding to the complexity, and that adds to uh, both the readability, the maintainability, and also the performance. Or I guess it takes away from the performance. Okay, so another way, so here we have our 4 arguments again. Another way of going about it is to name them. So you don't have to worry about the ordering issues. Here he's doing a very weird thing where the ultimate goal is for this drawbox method to accept either positional arguments or named arguments like this. So a way you can go about that is to define code that looks like this. I really don't like this. I mean, I think you should set a standard for what your code looks like, and just do that. If you're gonna use positional arguments, use them everywhere. If you're gonna use named arguments, like it's I don't want to have to guess if Dropbox uses positional arguments or named arguments, and I also don't want to every method to have to be defined in this way. So for me, it's like just choose one or the other and go from there.
Yeah, I generally agree with that. This might not be the best example of this, but sometimes you've certainly used code that does things like this, like an active record and junk like that. So it does happen occasionally. I've never seen it implemented this way. I usually would do an args splat and then like an ops double splat and then programmatically validate it and raise an argument error if it's not valid. I've never seen this approach of 4 optional positional arguments then used as defaults to keyword arguments. I never even thought about that. So yeah, I've never seen this approach before, and I probably wouldn't personally use it, but it's interesting.
Optional positional arguments. So here we're saying that the y in the middle is optional. They're not named arguments. So what we have here is an optional one surrounded by 2 required ones. So Ruby,
Sorry,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt you. I feel like, sorry, did he talk about some of the downsides of that very weird approach that we just looked at? I feel like he did. Maybe I missed.
Well, Nelson was pointing out consistency, which I think makes sense actually in this case. I think I kind of offered a little bit of a counter point that like in active record, you don't get consistency in this way. Like you can construct a query passing around strings that get interpolated in other strings or keyword, or you can use keyword arguments to interpolate. So it's pretty flexible in interface, but this domain, I would be inclined to use only the keyword argument approach for this one here. So the x1, x2, y1, y2, I'd be inclined to just go with that approach, unless there was a different. There could be a reason for me to violate that, but of all the options here, that one seems the best, is just the keyword arguments and not the positional arguments. So yeah, I think we talked about the pros and cons there, which is just kind of confusion and complexity, and Nelson mentioned inconsistency.
Yeah, but the author also mentioned performance, and that you could pass like how does he put it? You can have like duplicate, not duplicate per se, but you can how do I put that? You can pass something and sort of override it in the same call.
I think he gets to that later in the chapter. You're talking about where you have a frozen object and a constant and use that as the default.
No, he points that
No.
out directly on the.
Yeah, this is the example here where he says, oh, but the way that we've defined this method, we can have positional arguments and also the named arguments, but oops, which is which one are we actually going to use? Like, it's unclear, and also the like I mean,
Like this
it should
shouldn't
not be
work.
possible, right?
Should raise an error, yeah. But it
Right,
doesn't.
but I think that's the responsibility of the method author. They have to validate that and raise an argument error, a meaningful argument error, if you do this. Which that's definitely a con, that becomes your responsibility as the method author instead of Ruby giving it to you for free.
Yeah.
Although that
I
does
guess
mention performance briefly in that little paragraph there, though. But I mean, hashes are more heavyweight than the positional arguments. That makes sense. So it makes sense that it would be less performant. But ironically, I watched a talk from this author, and they did a bunch of work in the Ruby 3.4 implementation to eliminate to preemptively detect that a hash allocation for keyword arguments was unnecessary and skip doing it. So kind of ironically, that this author might be that since this book was released, because of the work of this author, this might actually be irrelevant now. The performance overhead. I don't know, but that's just kind of funny.
I see. All right. I guess I just wanted us to kind of touch on that before moving on. All right, Nelson.
Okay. Okay, so the optional positional arguments. Yeah, so we have this y defined as an optional positional argument here. It's surrounded by two required ones. So, and he also points out that Ruby does not allow you to surround a required positional argument with two optional positional arguments. Okay, so this section was important. I did not really know about post arguments. This was just very unclear to me.
I took a note. I'm kind of surprised post args is supported. So I had a similar, when I saw this, Nelson, I was also kind of surprised.
Yeah. I mean, this is the only book that I've seen it in, these post arguments, or that I remember it being in. It's possible I read it and just didn't remember. Okay, so
yeah, actually, I do think it was mentioned in Ruby under a microscope, I think, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we just discovered it when we probed it in an IRB session or something. I can't remember.
So here, the X argument is the leading argument. This is the optional argument, and the Z argument is the post argument. I don't usually write code like this very, very often.
Me neither. I don't think I've ever had required. If I ever have arguments after an optional argument, I've always used the splat to get the rest of the args. I've never written code like that personally. I actually didn't even know it was supported.
Okay. So the historical reason, so it's fairly rare to define methods like this, where you have the optional argument first, and then you have a post argument. So, and the historical reason is because they weren't supported by before Ruby 1.9, and so people just didn't uh, didn't do it. And also, it's just weird to me uh, to have the optional one first, and it also points that out. It's just like most people are likely to complain, and it'll probably seem strange to them. Yes, seems strange to me. I don't like it.
Yeah, what I would do here if I really wanted to do something like this is I would accept args, like a splat args. I would do a case on the arg size. And if the arg size is 1, I would do one thing. If it's 2, I'd do another. And if it was anything else, I'd raise an argument error. So it's weird. It's like weird to me to even see, even if you really wanted to do this, it surprises me to implement it this way. Although it is interesting. Maybe it's worth using here or there. Like, for example, the example I pasted into Slack just now with the regular expression and the index of the sub match, I would have assumed Ruby was switching on the number of arguments, not using a default argument for the first argument, or I mean, an optional argument for the first argument. But now I'm wondering how it's implemented, and it's probably actually implemented in C and doesn't matter. But yeah, I don't believe I've ever written code like this, ever, with the optional first and the required second. I don't think I've ever done that once.
Yeah. I mean, he does point out some examples where it makes sense. Like here, this is where it makes sense, where you have some sort of SQL, you have you want to get the identifier of an optionally get the identifier of the table and column, or just for the most often used case is just the column by itself. So, and it doesn't require the table. But if you do want the table, then you can provide it optionally. And it does make more sense to put the table in front because when you write the SQL, you write it table dot column. So
one thing, I don't think the author mentions this, but one thing I actually don't like about this code is that if you had in the calling code a local variable with the table name and a local variable with the column name, and you accidentally had nil for the table name, which is the kind of bug that happens all the time, the code here would incorrectly interpret it as they only passed me the column instead of giving an error. So what I would do here is I would do a splat args, and I would again switch on the number of arguments. So there is a difference between passing in only the column name and passing in nil for the table name and something for the column name. And passing nil for the table name should be an error, but this code won't give an error when it should. So I guess I'll take a note of that. But yeah, this actually to me doesn't even look behaviorally correct because it doesn't defend against an accidental nil table being passed in. It misinterprets the intent of the calling code if table is passed in as nil. You know what I mean?
yeah. Although, if
Whereas if you switch on the number of args, where you use the column name if it's one argument,
yeah,
you use both if it's 2 arguments, and you give an argument error otherwise, you now have defensive programming against the user passing in. Like if the user passes in a table of nil, you can distinguish between they passed me nil, which is not allowed, and they didn't pass me a table, but you cannot distinguish that in this code.
I can see a case where your method also falls down, but I don't know how to solve it. Where you intended to pass in both table and column, but you accidentally have nil for column.
Oh, yeah, you're right. That actually would be even worse because you would. So not the solution I have wouldn't be a problem because you would know whether they're passing you a table and a column or just
Yeah.
the column. in your case, if they passed you a nil column and that's all they passed you, yeah, that would be kind of interesting. Well, I guess that would work here. I think that actually would work. You would get a nil column.
Well,
and then
if you passed in the name of the table, and then nil for column, then you'd get one argument, and you'd incorrectly use the table name as the column.
Yeah, I don't think Ruby would do that. I think Ruby would know you had passed two arguments. It would populate both of them. So I think you would get the proper table name and then nil for column. Yeah, I think Ruby actually would handle that correctly with this code here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I want to ask something. It might be a very simple question, but I just don't know. How would you call this identifier method, the second version of it, if you wanted to pass in only the column name? So would you just do identifier passing in just
One. Yeah. That's
Just
interesting. He doesn't give, you're right. He doesn't give an example of that. He shows two examples with two arguments, but he doesn't show the one argument example. Yeah. So you would just do identifier bar.
so, but it wouldn't take that as the table argument?
You would pass in just identifier bar, and then in the method table would be nil and column would be bar.
Oh, interesting. I mean, I don't know if maybe if I've forgotten how it works, but how does that work? I
Well,
thought
you know what I could do? I could just do that. I'll do this in an IRB session. And I can like copy and paste the screenshot into Discord.
oh
But
yes,
yeah, it works. It works because Ruby knows how many arguments you're passing in. If you pass in one argument, Ruby knows I have one required argument and one optional argument. The one argument they passed into me must be the required argument, not the optional argument.
Hmm.
It's similar to how the splat deconstruction works too. Yeah, this is what I would have done to show this. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't have time to play with it. Oh, I was too lazy, I guess. Yeah, I want to see.
So identifier. So we'll just put in
Anything you want, really.
So yeah, we'll just put in nil.
See, so it Ruby knows. Ruby's like, I received one argument. I have one required argument and one optional argument. I will assign the one argument I received to the required argument, and I'll set the default to the optional argument, which the default in this case is no.
Interesting.
But something that this code doesn't handle that the way I would have done it does is if you did identifier nil common my column. Can you try that while you're here, Nelson? Because I feel like that'll print out what I don't want, which would be that my column is, or yeah, do. Actually, I don't know what would happen. I would have to play with this. I'm kind of curious what happens if you pass in nil and a string, and if you pass in string and a nil. Okay. I guess this does do the right thing there.
Ooh.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this behaves normally, if you ask me.
Yeah, I guess it does. Yeah.
Interesting. I didn't know about that. So I was wondering while reading the book, like what would happen if you passed in only one. I guess the author just thinks that, oh, this is so obvious. I don't have to like mention it in the book. Maybe that's why he didn't mention it.
Yeah, I mean, but it's also like these books take years to write, and sometimes you just, you forget to be more explicit.
Yeah.
I think it's something about being so familiar, and you kind of forget what it's like to be newer to the some of the concepts. Though I think it might be a combination of those things.
Well, we're also talking about a counterintuitive feature that neither me nor Nelson have ever used before. So it's also like we're kind of in the margins of Ruby code here or whatever. Like, so that
That's
maybe that might play a role too. Like, it's not even that important, I think, to understand this because I wouldn't have written the code this way. So
Yeah,
yeah.
true.
Okay, so this is the last section, I think. So REST arguments. This is not the default or the normal definition of REST arguments. Usually, you have a name here for the REST arguments so that you can actually use them in some way. Here, he's saying, well, you don't actually need to name the REST arguments. You would do this if you're throwing away the REST arguments. You didn't need them for some reason. So it works. He's just showing that it works. And so you can say, oh yeah, I'm gonna do like I'm gonna set bar to 2, and then I'm gonna call the superclass, and the superclass can handle the REST arguments. But this is I don't know. It's super contrived. I don't think I'd ever use this form.
I actually use this form a lot personally. Also,
without the
there's
named
two.
without the name.
Yeah, and also I think the author is incorrect about the only good use case for super. Sometimes you're delegating from one method to another, and you don't need a name for it. So you can actually use the asterisk as the name of the splatted args when delegating to another method. So that's one case. And then I wonder about the case where you happen to not care what the arguments are. Like you support multiple arguments, but you don't plan to use them. Seems like you could also use the asterisk for that case if you wanted to. So I can think of 2 other cases besides super that I might use the regular asterisk for. Because if I don't, otherwise I have to put like underscore args. Because my linter requires me to put an underscore for unused arguments. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, but he also says that I don't know if it's his opinion, but that it's almost always a sign of a poor method design. So maybe in his opinion, this is the only good use case. That's super. But I feel like he does something with like delegation and REST in the coming pages, but I don't quite remember the distinction between that and this.
By the way, in the previous code, when we set table to nil, what we would want to do is get an error. And since we didn't do that, it actually didn't work. So what I'll do in my free time, I'm going to write up some code to demonstrate what I was talking about with the table being nil. We don't have to return to here, but on that first line where table, we're printing out nil, that's actually wrong. We want an argument error here. Nil is not a valid table. So we should give an argument error because we passed in nil. And what I was getting at earlier is we don't have a way to distinguish between they accidentally passed in nil and they only wanted to give me a column. So I was actually wrong when I agreed that this works. That actually this doesn't work, and it's not obvious because we didn't code up the error handling. But I'll do that later and share it with the group, and then I think it'll be more clear what I was getting at.
Oh, but I'm curious though. It seems like nil doesn't negatively affect this method. Maybe that's why the author even uses it as the default for table, and maybe that's why it's been handled.
But passing in identifier nil common my column is clearly an error. It'd be more obvious if this were like a local variable or an argument we had received from elsewhere. It's like, you know how you always get all those null pointer errors all over the place in Java? This is the same thing where we thought we had a table, so we passed it to identifier, and identifier incorrectly assumed we didn't have a table. I'll code it up later. I'll code it up later and demonstrate the difference between the two, and I'll come up with a way to like show that we're doing something wrong,
I see.
or we're not getting the right result. Like we should get an error. I believe we should get an error if we pass in a nil table explicitly. That's not valid. If that's what we wanted to do, we're supposed to only pass one argument.
So here, can we do self dot method ident? Well, I'm trying. What I want to do is check the arity of. Well,
I actually don't know if the arity will be 1 or 2. What you really want to know is what's the number of arguments passed into us, which we lose if we go with this approach. I think that's information we've lost, unless there's a keyword in Ruby to access that. Is there a keyword? Like, because in JavaScript there is. I think you can call arguments to get a list of the arguments. I actually don't know if Ruby has a comparable concept, but if it does, then I guess we could do the error check. Because we could say if the argument size is 1, or if the argument size is 2 and table is nil, then raise argument error.
Well, let's.
But yeah,
let's move on.
Yeah, let's move on. I'll code this up on the side and share it in Discord later.
Okay. In the case where we only have a single, if we want just REST arguments, he says you should consider whether or not you pass to accept a single argument as an array. And I mean that's what I generally default to. For me, it just makes it clear that like this is a list of things. And I'm probably already generating an array somewhere else. So I don't know.
I do likewise. The only exception is if I'm like implementing a DSL, in which case the square brackets might have a negative impact on the expressiveness. So generally, that's what I agree, Nelson. And then there's weird edge cases where I wouldn't. I think things like accept and slice and methods like that, taking splatted arguments is not really necessary. I think they could have taken an array and it would have been fine. But yeah, so I would agree. It's really only in DSLs where I would want to not require the square brackets.
So he's saying here that if we have this format where we default we have a default value of an empty array, that it will allocate memory for that empty array every time that this a method is called. So in order to avoid the array allocation, you can use a frozen empty array. And in the case where we don't call, in the case where we call this method with the default argument, or I guess it would be no argument, because
no argument.
Yeah, then we don't create this new array, or a new array. Right. So
yeah, this is what I thought. This is what I thought was being referenced to earlier with performance, but I guess we were talking about something else totally.
Yeah, with this approach, calling A never allocates an array. One difference between the two approaches is that when you're accepting a single array argument, you need to ensure that you do not mutate the argument, and then he gives the syntax for that. And this is a bad idea for a method to mutate any arguments unless that is the purpose of the method, which, yeah, I agree with. And I'm not I'm not super careful in my code about freezing stuff, but I really should be. And here we're duplicating, either freezing or duplicating. So here we're duplicating so that we do not modify the values in the array.
I am very careful about duplicating. I'm not very careful about freezing, and I guess because I'm very careful about duplicating, I don't feel as much pressure to be careful with freezing for what it's worth.
Yeah, it's a good practice. I should do it. I just, I haven't gotten into the habit. So
Yeah, same here. Same here.
Yeah, so which API is nicer, the REST arguments or the single array argument? It depends on the method. Yeah, but I think in general you can default to using an array unless you, for some reason, are have reason to do otherwise. And that would be the case. Like it would be the case where I don't already have this thing in an array. Like it doesn't exist. It like doesn't exist anywhere else in my code as an array already, and I'm going to call this method with a list of things, and I'm not expecting an array back.
Yeah, again, for me, I do think about DSLs. Like if I'm in the Rails routes file using the router DSL, I'm not expecting to have to wrap something in square brackets. But in other places, it seems like it makes sense to just default to taking the array instead of the splatted arguments. So kind of just the same thought as.
So in addition to requiring an array allocation, Ruby does not optimize methods that accept an argument splat either, which is another consideration when you're thinking about using the REST argument. Yeah, so I guess splats are slower. I wonder about that though, because maybe it's slower in the interpreter, but not in the JIT, because what the JIT does is it analyzes the execution of the code, it looks at all the inputs and turns and looks at all the outputs and turns that into machine code. And shouldn't the JIT be able to look at the inputs and say, oh, splats are always going to be arrays?
Well, I guess it depends on how smart. Yeah, I think it depends on how smart the JIT is, and then also like something he points out here is when you do the splat array, you can and should directly mutate the array that's passed in, and that's because it actually is a duplicated array. So it could be that JIT can't get around the fact that one would, if you mutate one, it should have external side effects. If you mutate the other, it should not have external side effects. So it could be that because of that, there's only so much JIT could do. Although maybe it's smart enough to know this array is not mutated, perhaps because it's never accessed or something. I don't know. But yeah, when you do the splat, I think you have to allocate a new array, copy the elements over.
I mean, it's always going to be, you're always going to have an array. It's can't be anything else but an array.
Right, but in the first line there where we call A and we pass in an array, all we're doing is passing the reference to the external array, which is why if you mutate it, you could have unintended side effects. In the second one, it will create a new array,
yeah,
and then copy each element into the new array and give that array to the method, which is why the method can directly mutate that array without any side effects. It could be that I'm misunderstanding what you were getting at, though. So apologies if I'm talking about something different.
I mean, my question was, why does it even like? Maybe it matters in the in the interpretation phase. Like, yes, okay, in the interpretation phase, yes, it's got to allocate a new array, and that is memory allocation is an extra step. But what I'm saying is like once you have already, well,
Now, I think the compiled, the like just-in-time compiled code
yeah,
for one and the other has to be different because one has to do a memory copy and the other doesn't. So, and that can't go away just because you moved it into machine code.
I
It's
see.
still
I
it's still
see.
in the machine code. Yeah.
No, you're right. Yeah. Yeah, the whole memory allocation thing is just gonna take more time. Okay, that helps me understand. Um, so you can combine REST arguments with post arguments. Um, oh, I missed this part. I mean, these are the different combinations that you can have, right? Like you can have positional arguments with REST arguments. You can have positional arguments, optional arguments with REST. You can combine the REST with a post argument here. And he's saying that, wow, this is really weird. When would you ever use this? This is the only example I can think of where you would use this, where it's the move command, and the move command has either one source or multiple sources that you want to copy or you want to move. So you can either have a single file that you're going to move called foo, or you can provide it this file called foo, this file called bar, this file called baz, and you're going to move all of those files into this dir. Um, so this is how you would do that. You would basically move. So the first argument, you want to add it to the array. So this sources array, what you do is you put it at the front of the sources array. You iterate through the sources array, and you you move you move each source into the directory. Okay, so what page? I think that's all that I signed up for today, and we're at an
Yeah.
hour 40.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to ask a question about this move method here. So, sorry again if this is something that I should have found out on my own, maybe in IRB or something. But if we have a method that's defined this way with a REST argument and a post argument, uh, does it mean, I don't want to assume wrongly, does it mean that the last argument you pass in has to be that post argument? But I was
Yes.
wondering, oh, okay. I was wondering how it would
Yeah.
know where the rest stop and do.
So I think it does something like we have 2 required arguments. We received 4 arguments. I know that one of the required arguments is at the beginning, so I'm going to assign the first argument to that. I know that there's one required argument at the end, so I'm going to grab an argument off the end and put it into that, and the rest I'm going to throw into sources. It does something like that. It's looking at the number of arguments and where they're located. It's like, filling in all the required arguments, and then whatever is left over goes in sources.
I think that's really cool. What did he call the first one again? Was it the leading argument?
He said it was something like required arguments, optional arguments. I don't remember what he called the splatted arguments. And then there was the rest arguments, and then leading, optional, rest, and post.
Okay, leading, optional, rest, and post. And he said something later about how we can't use optional arguments and post arguments. Was it optional or?
Yeah. So the post argument, if you use a post argument, you can't give it a default. And I think it's just that the Ruby grammar would get confused because then it's ambiguous what you're even trying to do, I guess.
Okay.
Right. But then imagine let's say you have like Ruby wouldn't know which set of optional arguments to assign which arguments to. You know what I just realized, by the way? I think this chapter kind of confuses the concept of parameters and object and arguments and calls them all arguments, which is fine. It doesn't bother me much, but I believe down there where you see A and you see X, Y, and Z, those are parameters, not arguments.
Those are
Yeah.
yes.
He
That's
says,
correct.
yeah, he says the X argument. Technically, it should be the X parameter, but that's okay. I don't mind that. I can think of it either way. But yeah, this is actually conflating arguments with parameters. But now that I'm trying to answer Samuel's question, it's harder because I want to say you have 100 arguments, and Ruby has to figure out which parameters to assign them to. I think if you have two separate blocks of optional arguments, it becomes ambiguous which. If you have two separate blocks of optional parameters, it becomes ambiguous which arguments go to which parameters. So I think you can only have one group of optional parameters in order for the Ruby runtime to have an unambiguous set of rules to do the assignments.
That's what it looks like. But I think for this answer, I just have to accept it because I don't think I can relate at all to like the implementation, like why it doesn't work. Because on this, yeah.
Well, think of it this way: if I passed in, like, just imagine that the only parameters were like rest argument and then one post argument with a default, and you're the Ruby runtime and you have one argument. Are you going to put that one argument in the rest parameters, or are you going to put it in the post arguments and put an empty array in the rest argument? Like, you need a rule now for that. And then if you also could have had optional arguments before the rest arguments, it gets even more ambiguous and you would need more rules. So I think just grammatically speaking, at a certain point, they had to stop. And I already mentioned, and Nelson mentioned this too, I was surprised that post arguments are even supported. So I don't view post arguments as even necessary. So if they then made post arguments capable of taking defaults, to me, it's just even more unnecessary grammatical complexity, in my opinion. So it sounds like this is just where they drew the line for grammatical complexity.
I see. That makes sense to me now, actually. Where would you put the argument? All right, cool. I didn't want to assume wrong, so I just wanted to ask.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I have a question, and this is something I noticed throughout. I think this chapter and I think in Ruby under microscope. So when the author talks about the term API in the context of this book, does it have the same meaning as the term API when you're working now, let's say with a web application and you're using its API? You're accessing its functionality through the API.
No, I think that's like a common confusion. I think when the author writes API, I'm just thinking of like a public interface to some subsystem. It could be a library, for example. Like a library has an API. You know what I mean? The public interface of a library is its API. So we do in web development, for whatever reason, we kind of have used API to be synonymous with an HTTP API, but that's not the only type of API. Like really any public interface is going to be, I would say any public interface between subsystems is going to be what I would call an API. So a library has an API, for example. And you could think of it as a subsystem, even though it lives in the same process as the code that's calling it. It doesn't have to be two separate processes separated by a network.
And this is something that just came up in my mind. I always think of a programmatic API as all the public classes and methods, and it excludes all the private methods. Is that how you think about it?
Yeah, I think of it that way, but I do think there has to be some sort of grouping of some sort. So like maybe they're all within the same module as each other. Like they probably should have some kind of subsystem boundary communicated somehow. But yeah, that's exactly how I think of it. It's the public classes and methods that's the API, but it has to be of a subsystem of some sort. There is a fuzzy sense of boundary, even if it's not that explicit in the code. It's just that when you have if you have an API over a network with separate processes, it's like the boundary is as explicit as, or is as big as it can possibly, or as obvious as it can possibly get. But yeah, I would say if you have a module with a public class with public methods in it, and that the stuff in that module is kind of trying to accomplish something like relevant, that those public classes and methods are the API of whatever subsystem that module is referring to. So yeah, I think of it the same way, Nelson, except there is some sense of a boundary, which is what a public interface is, right? Like the public interface is supposed to be a boundary. So yeah, I basically think of it the same way as you, Nelson. It's just there's like a little bit of an organizational requirement on top of that, I think I would give. Like I wouldn't, if I wrote a class at the global level, I wouldn't refer to that class's public methods as an API, because it's not, that one global class isn't communicating any sense of boundary to me, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So that public class has a public interface, but it doesn't have an API. But if I take that class, put it in a module, and combine it with a different class, and those classes are somehow related, and that's why they're grouped in the module, now that class's public interface is part of that subsystem's API. Is the way I think about it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Makes sense to me.
So maybe another thing I wanted to say, when we were going through Ruby under a microscope, I think around amongst the first chapters, I'm not sure, I think either chapter 3 or chapter 4, there's a section that talks about arguments. So in case Samuel, you have some time, you can go through it, and it can help clarify some of the things you are asking. Maybe a different perspective is what you need. So you can check it out.
Thanks. I think I really need those books because I missed out on what's the first one? Eloquent Ruby and Ruby under the microscope. So I haven't really refreshed some of those basic concepts, and it seems like the author here doesn't even care so much for the really simple parts in this book.
Well, I think one challenge the author has is that his audience is supposed to be, he's trying to target like very experienced Ruby programmers, I think. In fact, both of the last book and this one, and I guess that's like a challenge for an author, right? Because you're going to have, so like Newton is learning programming and Ruby for the first time, like together. This book, I feel like Newton is not technically in the target audience of the book we're reading right now. Which doesn't mean he can't get value out of it. It does mean that he can't really complain if a basic concept isn't explained thoroughly, because it's just not Newton. So I guess that's like a challenge the author has, is like it's hard to make a book where everybody is the audience, or a technical book, I guess.
And the book is already quite long, I would say. So if you were to target everybody, I think it would be a very big book. So maybe I should go to Eloquent. Eloquent Ruby seems to me like a more beginner friendly, something as a refresher, I would say. But
I feel like you guys are getting value out of this book, though, because at least you're at least figuring out what questions to even ask, like, and now you're aware of which concepts are out there and stuff. So even if you're not the target audience and it might not make perfect sense on the first read, I think there is just value to the exposure. But I mean, that's ultimately up to you, I guess, whether it's helping or not the best use of time.
Oh, it's definitely helping. I feel like I just don't know how it is to keep asking some of those. I don't think you guys have a problem with those questions, I'll say.
Well, with me and Nelson, for example, we were both surprised by post arguments being present. So we have some, and a lot of your questions were around how does Ruby handle the post arguments. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like your questions aren't that different than the questions me and Nelson have. I mean, it might be a little bit more basic, but me and Nelson are kind of surprised by the same things that you are. We're just making different, I guess we have a little bit more intuition to make certain assumptions about, well, if that's the case, then this must be what Ruby's doing. But we were still surprised by it.
I see. Thanks. Cool.
Nelson has opened the book. That's the section I was talking about.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's when Ruby when Ruby sees your method definition, it compiles it to YARV instructions. These are instructions that the interpreter can run, and then it creates a local table where it stores your arguments. So here we see that A and B are the two parameters defined for this method. And so here we see that the local table has defined, we store the variable sum, we store the arguments A and B in a local table, and the local table exists for as long as this method exists. And then when this method goes out of scope, this local table goes out of scope. And then the local table, in addition to storing, the positional arguments here, it says that there's it stores additional information which can distinguish the positional arguments A and B from the rest arguments there.
Oh, it does mention post argument as well.
Yeah, and then optional arguments. So here B is an optional argument. So it stores, what types of arguments are there as well. And this is all, implemented in C. So a lot of the things that you see in this set local or whatever, you can assume that it's not it's an internal to the way that they coded the virtual machine in C.
I see. So I think I misunderstood. So when Newton was pointing me to this book, it's not necessarily a simpler or more beginner friendly explanation, I would say,
Yeah.
but more of like an in depth look at
Yes.
some of those. Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I would like to read the book actually.
This book is out of date, and they're rewriting. The author is rewriting this book. If you are going
Yeah.
to read it now, be prepared to do additional research just to figure out how things work now, or you can start reading some of the early. I think
Is
the
it in
author
beta?
has posted some of the early chapters. Um, Pat Shaughnessy. No, I want his blog.
Where he talked about updating the book?
Yeah, while
think
he's
the-
looking for that, I guess like if you're going to read this out of date book, it just depends on why you're reading it. If you're curious to find out how a specific implementation of a specific obsolete version of Ruby worked, then go for it. But just understand that that's what you're doing. And even if you get the newest version of the book, you would still need to understand that it's for a very specific implementation of Ruby, which is fine. I found the book fascinating. I have no regrets about reading the old out-of-date book. It's just important to know that you're kind of geeking out over a very specific version at a very specific moment in time.
The recordings are also online on of when we read through the book, so those might also help to make sense of the current book.
I see. Yeah, I think that's helpful to look at it that way. It's not really a concept per se, like polished Ruby, but more. I mean, a concept like that will help you design better and stuff, but more about like how it was implemented
Yeah,
or how it's
the
implemented at the
the
time
internals.
of writing. Mm. So that could change, is what you're saying.
It
It
has
has
changed,
changed a
yeah,
lot.
yeah, and it will change. There's a good chance that as soon as the new book is released, that it'll already be, you know, changed. So, yeah.
I
But
see.
I really enjoyed the book, and it's helpful. And maybe you've noticed that in today's conversation, some of the things we were actually discussing were influenced by the understanding of how a virtual machine could work under the hood, even if it has changed. Just the understanding of the various ways it could work under the hood did color our conversation, particularly around optimizations. Um, and
Yeah,
even
I
the
mean,
singleton class,
it was almost.
adding
Oh,
Yeah, even the
even
singleton.
even the
So
singleton classes, it's like important to know that there's a hidden class pointer, which in Ruby under a microscope is very obvious because it's right in your face, because that's the whole point of the book. Whereas when you're in IRB, I don't even think you can access that pointer really. You can ask for the singleton class, and that's the closest you can get to it. You can't really get to a real raw connection with that class pointer. Because like I said, the class method will skip the singleton class and all the modules. It'll go through that linked list. So yeah, even the singleton class conversation is kind of helped by having read Ruby under a microscope, even though it's describing a implementation of Ruby that's no longer really in heavy use anymore.
I see. All right, I'll check it out in my spare time.
It's up to
Yeah.
you. I would say if you're reading it and enjoying it, great. If you're reading it and not enjoying it, then I would just read something else. Like I think it's really, if you're not enjoying it, then probably better to just go read something else. But I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a very interesting book.
yeah, and I think a lot of the concepts in there can be extrapolated because you get a sense that like, oh, this is how this virtual machine worked 10 years ago. But you know, this there's no getting around the fact that like you have to do things in a certain way in a virtual machine. Like there's no getting around the fact that you're going to have a a lexer, a parser, a like you're probably going to compile the code. You need a garbage collector in there in some way. You need if you have a if you want to make it smarter, you need a JIT, and like how do all these pieces fit together? Like the implementation details are not as important as like the computer science that I learned from reading the book.
I think I will enjoy it because I am currently trying to read. Um, what is that book? Computer Science: A Programmer's Perspective. CSPP, I think.
Mm.
CSAP is what they call it, or something like that. CSPP, CSAPP, something like that. And I think that I don't know, it might give me some of the same because it talks about like the whole system and interpreters, compilers, and stuff like that. And it does that in C as well. So I feel like it might tie together at some point for me. I'll check it out for sure.
Yeah, I actually had to learn this stuff from the Dragon book. You guys might not be familiar with that. I had to learn this stuff in a very old school fashion,
Oh,
using like a classic book, and it was all in C. was all like very old school AT&T Unixy stuff. But yeah, it was, yeah.
Sounds. We don't want to check it out.
It was pretty crazy though, because we had to like on paper be able to do what the compiler is doing, and it's a very complicated state machine. It gets pretty confusing actually. So yeah, that was an interesting thing to learn how it works. It almost seems like magic.
I see. Fubara. I watched your talk today.
Oh yeah. Thanks for watching that.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing. I sent you a message on Discord, by the way, about it. I'd like to watch
Yeah,
it again.
I thought I replied to that. Let me see. Unless you're talking about a new message. Yeah, I think
Maybe
I
I-
replied to it.
Oh,
Let me
maybe
see. Unless I meant to reply and didn't, but I think I replied. Oh yeah,
Oh, you
yeah, I replied.
You did. I missed it. Okay. Oh, cool.
Yeah, I'll code up on the side the thing I mentioned earlier about how I would have programmed that optional argument like table column method, and
Oh, yeah.
I think that'll clarify stuff what I was talking about there, and it might also kind of reveal like one of the reasons I just never even thought to use post arguments, because it just never even crossed my mind in particular. Ruby's an interesting programming language, by the way, because in a lot of other object-oriented programming languages, they have this concept called polymorphism. And the idea with polymorphism is that, and I don't even really think this necessarily has to be it usually gets taught as like a key pillar of object-oriented programming. But the gist of it is that I should be able to define the same method multiple times with different types and arguments. Whereas in Ruby, you can't do that. So that's why in Ruby, you would have like a case statement on the number of arguments passed in. So Ruby is unusual in that way, in that in other object-oriented programming languages, you would actually define the method twice. You would define the method once with one argument, then you would define the method another time with a second argument.
Sorry, is
and
that
then
related? Oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, and then the compiler knows. The compiler sees, oh, they're calling the version with two arguments. I'm going to use the symbol for the version of the method with two arguments, and then the linker links it to that, assuming there's a linker. But forget the whole part about the linker. Point being, the compiler knows which version of the method you're calling and just calls that version of the method. So in other programming languages, you write multiple versions of the method for each method signature you want to be able to handle. Whereas Ruby, because it's message passing and it's all hinged on the message name, it's like the symbol of the message that matters, not the signature of the method. You write the method one time and then you have to programmatically handle all the different types of arguments in the method definition. So Ruby, if you've only programmed in Ruby, you might think that's normal in object-oriented programming languages, but much more common is polymorphism, where you have different, you just write you want three different method signatures, you write all three different method signatures. You don't write one ambiguous method signature and then programmatically figure out what the calling code was trying to do. But in Ruby you do. In Ruby, you write one ambiguous method signature and then programmatically decide which path to go down.
Sorry, is that what method overloading refers to?
Yes, that's method overloading. Yeah.
Oh, I see.
In Ruby, there's only method overriding.
Yeah, in Ruby, you cannot overload methods in Ruby.
Yeah. I was looking at some Elixir code. I see that they do that there as well. They define the same method like multiple times with just different arguments and stuff. I think that's pretty cool.
I actually really like that part of it, because it lets you break down. It does pattern matching to detect which version of the method you want, and it means that you don't have to do a whole bunch of if statements or case statements in your Ruby method to figure out all the different use cases for this method. Instead, it's defined in the method signature and it pattern matches dynamically on the method signature. So it's very powerful and it creates very clear, concise code. I really like it.
Hey guys, I gotta drop off actually because I have someone here to fix my air conditioner, so I'm excited about that. But
Oh,
they just rang the doorbell, so I'm gonna drop off.
okay.
All right.
I'll have to
All right,
show you
peace.
this next
Later,
time.
everybody.
Then.
Okay.
And bye. Oh, so you were talking about Elixir there, right? You like that about Elixir?
Yeah.
Ah, nice. I also wanted to say something about Elixir. I don't know, does this have to be recorded as well? Do you record
Let's
all
stop the
the?
recording.
Oh, okay.